Okay, it's very nice to be here, and before I start I should say this is my first chance ever to lecture my wife and to know I'm going to get away with it. Okay. I want to begin by thanking Roger, Stacey, Gary and the other colleagues from here and the students who have come from Grand Rapids College to Ireland, and on a number of levels. It's very nice to have an interaction with this college. It's a great pleasure to work with the people from here. But there are other levels, and one of the levels, for me, one of the important ones, is that the interaction between America and Ireland has been very positive for Ireland, perhaps almost as positive as it has been for America, and particularly over the last 30 years of the Troubles, since Jimmy Carter made the first effort to bring the Brits into line with everyone else's thinking, and that is we needed to talk, because up until that point, England would not talk about Northern Ireland outside of it being a domestic problem. So Americans have every right to be very proud of their interaction with Ireland North and South and with England in Ireland's cause. But it comes right down to the level of the students visiting. When students visit and confront Ian Paisley and say, well, we're Americans and we'd like to know you, Mr. Paisley, barriers start to come down, and when barriers start to come down, people start to work together, then we have a chance of more lasting peace than we would otherwise have. We work with about 12 US colleges. Roger, now that he's gone away, I can say without reservation is the most knowledgeable of the Irish history professors who come from any of those colleges by far. Also by far, unfortunately, the most enthusiastic. And when you're flat on the floor, he wants to do something else you hadn't thought of, that you didn't know you could do in Ireland. But the other great quality that Roger Schlosser has is that he's willing to learn. So when I say, no, Roger, we can't do that, just sometimes he listens. Now, who am I and what am I doing here? For 25 years or thereabouts, I worked in third-level education teaching management. I worked before that for Guinness Group in a marketing department in Dublin, so I know a little bit about the marketing of Guinness. And I know and I observe a little bit about the drinking of Guinness when American students come. Very unusual behaviour, I have to say. I remember 6 students. I had a pint with a professor from St. Olaf College, and after 4 hours and 10 minutes, I had to leave him because he was still only halfway down his pint, and I had other things to do. And I met some of his students coming in, and they said, we think we'll try some Guinness. And a couple of hours later, I thought, I'd better go back and check on these guys. And they were trying a pint of Guinness. Between them. Between them. It was being passed around. They were having little sips. Behaviour I'd never witnessed before. So we work with all these different colleges, and it's always a great pleasure to have Grand Rapids College come to us. This year, I'm going to talk about the flight of the Earls, but it's difficult in a sense to talk about it in a very chronological way. So I'm going to skip and hop a little bit around it. I hope at the end of it I've given you more of a flavour for the people who were on the flight and the plight of the people who left on the flight, as opposed to the major international event that it was at the time. Why it's of interest this year is it's the 400th anniversary. It's 400 years in September since the 99 people left the waterway that's right outside our home and sailed forever into exile from Ireland. It's very strange because it's just in some senses a minor event in Irish history, yet it has left its mark on everybody who's Irish and who's ever come across it, to the extent that in September, on the anniversary of the flight, I was one of 20,000 people or thereabouts who were on a beach, the beach that the flight left from 400 years ago, in awful weather, with beacons and fireworks and Irish music and you name it, and all the boats that the local yacht club could muster moving around in the waters of Lough Swilly right in front of us. So it was a very large, very significant, very important event in Irish history. To set the world scene a little bit, what was going on in the world at the time as we knew it. And I borrowed this map from Stacey. May not be the best visual aid we've ever seen, but it's a map of medieval Europe. And what I wanted you to take from this map is the proximity or location of Ireland in relation to Spain in relation to France and in relation to England. Okay, not in relation to America. Okay, the power bases of the world then, the superpowers then, the real superpower, I suppose, in the world at that stage was Spain. Okay, England may have had notions about being a superpower then too, but the real powerhouse of the world was probably Spain. And so Ireland was part of a world stage. We in Ireland, being on a little island, think that it was just all about Ireland. It wasn't just all about Ireland. So what was happening at that time was we were discovering the New World. That was the beginning of the discovery of the New World. About that time, big things were happening on Earth. And the Spanish, the Portuguese, the English were all making money from the New World. So that was an emerging thing. Another emerging thing was the Reformation. And the Reformation had major impact on what happened in Ireland in the lead up to the flight of the Earls. In fact, it became a religious war, perhaps for the first time in the 9 Years' War, which, I should explain, the 9 Years' War culminated in the flight of the Earls. So we have a situation where there's a lot of changes happening, a lot of changes. Maybe we're seeing increasing influence of Parliament in some countries, a decreasing influence by monarchies in some countries, but it's all unclear. No one's quite sure what the end game is here, what's going to come out of all of this. In Ireland, there's a saying that there were kings and queens on Ireland's shore when paint was the clothes the English wore. You'd think about that, do you? At least 1,000 years before England had kings and queens, Ireland had kings and queens. So we had this situation in Ireland vis-a-vis the English. I don't know if this is common to what you hear about, is where we were uneducated, ignorant, had no past. We were being painfully referred to as not that long ago as bog dwellers until they arrived in 1610 or 11. We weren't. This was an educated society, as educated perhaps as any other society in Western Europe at the time, and with all the artifacts and trappings that went with that at that time. Emerging from that, and I'm getting somewhere, don't worry, in relation to the flight, we had the grandfather of one of the major players in the 9 Years' War, Manus O'Donnell, collect all the scripted works on Irish history, and particularly the history of St. Columba, gathered into one place and wrote a history of St. Columb Kill is the name of the book, in 1550s. In the 1550s we have this Ruth Dudley Edwards, or Dudley Edwards himself, refers to Manus O'Donnell as a Renaissance prince. Okay, so here we are in the mid-1500s. We begin to have an emerging Irish society with some writing, some reflection going on. But then we are hit by the Reformation. And if you want to follow through on detail on this, read Brendan Bradshaw's book on the Reformation in Ireland and the damage that was done to society here by the only national structure we had was the church. We had monasteries, we had churches, we had priests, we had people. I'm trying to think of the Archbishop Cray, for example, trying to establish a secondary school system right across Ireland at this time. We had all of this going on, and suddenly Henry VIII declared himself King of Ireland. Now, Henry VIII and people before him had the right to have the jitters about Ireland at times, because there were two guys, and I think both of them at separate times were involved in this, Perkin Warbeck and Lambert Simnel, who got help from Ireland to become pretenders to the throne of England and were supported by the great Earl of Kildare and made their way back to England in one case, and with Irish soldiers finally got caught and committed to the Tower. In those days, interestingly, how the English punished people who were pretenders was they humiliated them. So they gave you a job in their kitchen. They didn't execute you. But when this guy went too far, eventually they put him in the Tower of London and they executed him. So the English might have been a little bit edgy about Ireland as a possible enemy, but also as a country from which was very close by and from which it was very hard to protect itself from invasion. Next major event that all of you have heard about in this room is the whole business of the Spanish Armada. The Spanish decided in 1588 they were going to send a huge armada of ships to invade England to put a Catholic monarch back on the throne. And they sent, I think it was 168 galleons to sea, and they got blown off course and attacked by the English, and, well, the rest is history, as they say, but many of them perished on the Irish shores. The big worry for the English was that the Irish would assist the Spanish and that the Spanish would invade England from Ireland, which it was very easy for the Spanish to land in Ireland, very easy for the Spanish to cross from Ireland into England. So the English had concerns about this. So in 1588, they decided it was time to make sure that while the Spanish were agitating, the Irish didn't assist them. So they went out and systematically asked for hostages from the Irish clan leaders. So you gave them your son. They took your son lived with them. They knew that because your son was with them, you'd behave yourself. So this was a nice deal. Your son got to party with all the girls in the camp and had a great time and sent you home looking for money to do more partying. And you worried about his health, and the English kept a close eye on him. And it was an honour-bound thing, and they didn't go away. But in the case of one clan, they had particular worries, and that was the O'Donnell clan of Donegal, because there was a young man growing up then who was, according to legend, going to expel the English from Ireland, and he became known as Red Hugh O'Donnell. They tricked him on board a wine trading vessel in Lough Swilly, again right outside our home. They took him to Dublin, they put him in irons in the Tower, in the Birmingham Tower in Dublin Castle. And they held him for 3 years during the Spanish problem. He escaped once, was recaptured, escaped again into Wicklow. And in Wicklow, he joined up with the O'Byrne clan, the O'Toole clan. They brought him back to Donegal. And almost immediately, he declared war against the English and went into open warfare, because once he escaped, the English moved up, took his castle from his mother, who was a daughter of a Lord of the Isles, a MacDonald from Scotland. And having taken his castle, of course, he wanted his castle back, so he went up there. His father, who was in his dotage, is what the annals of the Four Masters say, he was put into, or he went into Donegal Abbey to become an academic, shall we say. In those days, universities in Ireland were in the monasteries, and people who had some thinking to do or writing to do repaired to the monasteries, and in the monasteries they did all this work, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So, Black Hugh, as he was known, retires. Red Hugh takes over the chieftainship, and the English immediately move north. They take the town of Enniskillen, or they attempt to take the town of Enniskillen, which is in the central part of the Midlands, or a little bit to the west of the central part, northern part of the Midlands in Ireland. They take that. O'Donnell assists in taking it back. This starts the 9 Years' War. This is the first act of open warfare against English rule in Ireland in the 9 Years' War. And from there, it gets serious. The English get very serious about this war effort. They send over their best knights. Sir Tom Jones, Sir Elton John, defenders of the realm. They send over Conyers Clifford and John Harrington and all these other guys who lead armies, three-pronged attacks on the north. They're defeated in the Curlew Mountains, where the Gaelic chieftain statue is. If you go on the web and look up the Gaelic chieftain, you see this wonderful ironclad statue in the Curlew Mountains where Red Hugh defeated one of the English attacks. They were defeated in the Gap of the North at Moira Pass by O'Neill's, we call them, these were the very young soldiers, the guys of 16, 17 years of age who went and harried these English soldiers into difficult situations, and they'd end up having to withdraw rather than be confronted by an army. They defeated them at Clontibret in a battle which ran for 3.5 miles. And at Clontibret, a young man called O'Kane saved the life of Hugh O'Neill. Whenever an English soldier knocked him off his horse and was about to slash him with a sword, O'Kane got the English soldier first. Now, why I mention this is an important part of what happens in relation to the relationship between O'Kane and O'Neill is an important issue when it comes to the flight of the Earls. The main battle that the Irish won was the Battle of the Yellow Ford, and it was fought at Armagh, quite near to where the Battle of Benburb was fought some 45 years later, when a nephew of Hugh O'Neill again defeated the English. At the Yellow Ford, the Irish fought a pitched battle against the English. The English didn't believe the Irish would ever fight a pitched battle against them. The Irish picked their ground. The Irish made sure the English had a long walk before they had a fight by pushing them up one side of the river and all that kind of thing, tired them out, and finally routed them, killing more than half of their army or thereabouts on the field of battle and in pursuit. The effects of this battle across Europe, the effects of this victory across Europe really cannot be overestimated. All of the significant powers across Europe said Queen Elizabeth's armies have been beaten in open battle in Ireland by the Irish. This was next to unbelievable. And it resulted in almost instantaneous reaction in Ireland, where Hugh O'Neill became virtual king of Ireland. And in 1599 he toured all of Ireland, sorting out all the problems for all the little clans who had issues, election issues with leaders and so on, and sorting out all the disputes. And he had this triumphant march all over Ireland, came back to his base in Dungannon and settled down, and the Queen decided to try again. Now, there were some truces along the way, but she sent Lord Essex. And anyone who's ever watched any television program about Elizabeth I will note that Lord Essex always comes into this. He's a young man. He's a proficient soldier. He's won some campaigns for her. She sends him to Ireland with 20,000 soldiers. Unheard of army. She wanted to get O'Neill in particular, who she regarded as a traitor. So 20,000 men, led by Essex, fully equipped, went to Ireland. And Essex disobeyed his orders. He was supposed to go north to Armagh and find and defeat O'Neill with these superior forces. Instead, he went south, and he went to where my wife is from, or near enough, and got defeated there in a running battle, later became known as the Pass of the Plumes, because the English ran away so fast that all their plumes fell off. And there was some disease among they suffered a winter in Ireland, which can be very severe, could be very severe at those times with the boglands and all of the forestry and all of that. And then he decided to go north. So Essex now decides, this is Lord Devereux, he decides to go north now with a weakened army, and O'Neill, of course, being a strategist, decides this is a wonderful, I'll talk to him now. And I believe, historians believe, that in a private conversation, and this is described by people who could see what was going on, these two men went on their horses out into the river till they were up to their knees in water, and they had a private conversation. Queen Elizabeth was very old. She couldn't last much longer. The heir to the throne was Scottish. Scottish were considered kin to the Irish. So everybody speculates that this conversation that happened between O'Neill and Essex was really about, listen, Mr. Essex, if you're a good boy, I'll help to put you on the throne, if you like. Certainly it seems to have been what Elizabeth assumed, because when Essex went back to England, he did get involved in some kind of a coup attempt, and she beheaded him. Okay? Now, interesting little aside here is, we had a professor from, I remember the name of the college now, down in Maryland, come to us. His name is Gerald Casway. He wrote a book on Hugh O'Neill's nephew called Owen Roe O'Neill and the Struggle for Catholic Ireland. And he came to see us a number of years ago. We went down into Dungannon and Armagh, looking around the place, and he told me this story. He said, I was down here about 7-8 years ago, and I was looking for Owen Roe's father's house and hold. Chief house and hold is how it's described in the historical documents. And I went around the countryside trying to see where it would be that there could be such a house. And somebody said to me, try that line of trees, and try this line of trees, and try the other line of trees. Eventually, he said, I went down where there was a line of old trees, and there was a pile of moss-covered stones at the end of this line of trees. And I thought, yeah, maybe I'll ask. So I went to the nearest big house, and someone opened the door. He thought it was a pheasant that opened the door. And he went in, and he had tea with an elderly lady called Cody. And literally, he said, we had tea with the pheasants. They came in the window, sat around, and went out the door when they felt like it. And I talked to the woman, and I said, your family's been here 400 years. Did you hear any stories at all in your family about what might have been here before you came? She said, no, she said. And she got up, and she went to her bookcase, and she took down a book. And she said, we did hear there were books around here, and this one's been in the house forever, kind of thing. So Gerald Casway opened the book, and it was a copy of Orlando Furioso, which is a romantic story about Constantinople from the early 1500s. and it was Sir John Harrington's translation of it. Sir John Harrington was having tea, or Guinness, at the side of the river while the two men were talking. And Sir John Harrington, in his notes, stated that he was surprised to find that O'Neill's sons could read. So he gave them a copy of his book. So Gerald Casby had in his hand the copy of Orlando Furioso that Sir John Harrington gave to O'Neill's sons in 1599. Okay, a national treasure, I would have said. And another link with our past, with our destroyed past. So it's now in a bank vault somewhere, and the government is taking care of whatever transaction may have to happen to get it to the National Museum. But a little tangible story about now. You think about that, you say, well, the O'Neill's sons, they were learning Latin. They were able to read Latin, they were able to read English, they were, of course were able to read and write in Irish and all of that, okay? So there was an education there that we might even consider a little bit beyond our own education today, some of us, including me who can't speak any other language. So, moving on from Essex, he goes back to England. The Queen is furious, won't meet him, all this kind of thing, ends up beheading him. She still wants to defeat the Irish. She still wants to make them her subjects again. The English regarded Ireland as part of England, if you like. They were subjects of the English. If they did something wrong, they were traitors. Okay, they were being treacherous. They weren't being rebellious. They were traitors. So the chief traitor in all of the land at that time was Hugh O'Neill. So she sent over a guy called Charles Blount. Charles Blount is Lord Mountjoy. And Lord Mountjoy, you're welcome, sir, believe it or not. Lord Mountjoy introduced famine to Ireland at that time. So they subjected the Irish nation, or what was left of the Irish nation, to famine. In the midst of all this, the one thing that O'Neill had been waiting for all along was help from Spain. And it arrived 300 miles away in the dead of winter. And O'Neill had no real option. He had to help his Spanish allies. They had come to help him. But he couldn't leave his lands defenseless against this spread of famine that was going on. But eventually, having waited a couple of months while the Spanish were under siege in the town of Kinsale, he got up and he walked with his armies all the way to Kinsale. And in a mix-up, the Irish got defeated. The Irish, whilst moving their forces up toward the battle, in misty morning weather, in dead of winter, suddenly found themselves with the English armies facing them on their flank. And the battle was over before it started. In fact, the Irish never really got to engage in the battle. And for example, the O'Donnell army never even got to the battlefield. So whereas they were defeated and lost, I think, around about 1,000 men, they were still capable of making their way back home, all the 300 miles back home, and they did that. And they spread the word they had won, so they wouldn't be attacked along the way. And of course, it weakened their situation. The Spanish army was allowed to go home. When it went home, the Spanish colonel in charge of the army said, "Surely Christ never died for people like these," talking about the Irish. His commanders, or his king, had him beheaded for cowardice at Kinsale, or had him executed. I don't know how they did it. But, so they're gone back to Spain, and what we have now is a situation where the Spanish are willing yet again to help. Red Hugh O'Donnell, the chieftain of the O'Donnell clan, leaves immediately after Kinsale, goes to Spain, asks the king for help. The king says, "Okay, I'm preparing an army and all these ships." Red Hugh heads off to see his nephew in university, and on his way back from university he falls ill and he dies, and the help never comes from Spain for O'Neill. So O'Neill knows at this stage that he's on his own. He's absolutely on his own. And he's fighting a rearguard action because now the English have finally discovered that they were able to land quite easily on the northern shores of Ireland and attack him from the north by setting up all kinds of castles, and particularly Coleraine and Derry were set up at that time, and by finding one or two treacherous Irish men who would help them discover the country, map it, and find ways of infiltrating parts of it that they were never familiar with before. So O'Neill is now being pushed from two sides. And as he's pushed from two sides, eventually he surrenders. He comes in. He comes down to Mellifont Abbey. And there he submits to to Charles Blount, Lord Mountjoy, 4 days after Elizabeth dies. But they don't tell him Elizabeth is dead, because they knew if he knew that Elizabeth was dead, he would not have submitted and would have waited for King James to deal with him in some different way. In fact, King James deals with him in a pretty decent way. O'Neill surrenders his lands, gets most of them back. He's got to live as an English subject in the English way, subject to magistrates and all that kind of thing. And when I remembered your comment last night about disowning your daughter because she became an administrator, was that it? Right. So this was the problem in Ireland. It wasn't about the kings and the chieftains anymore. It was about the administrators, the people who come in to administrate the territory or administer the territory. They messed up the whole thing. They saw opportunities to make fortunes, and in particular, Arthur Chichester made fortunes out of this and moved on to make fortunes in other parts of the world afterwards. And they manipulated the situation so that the relationship between the old clan chieftains became fractious. And of course, in the old days, that would have been solved by Gaelic law. Now, the Gaelic people were forced to resolve it by English law. And anybody who thinks that it's easy to use English law, to look at some of the recent cases in Ireland, the Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, and so on and so forth, and how English law doesn't work for Irish people. It certainly didn't work for Irish people then. They didn't understand it. And in some ways, there are parallels between them and what happened to them and what happened to the Native Americans here, in that they found themselves out of depth in someone else's culture, but forced to be there. They didn't have an option. They couldn't repair to their old methods of doing things. So this goes on for a number of years. And finally, O'Neill hears rumours that he may be going to the Tower of London. And if he doesn't watch himself, the king may swoop. Now, King James, to try and, it's a good time to do this, King James was a wonderful man. He was famous for a number of things. One of them is he wore mittens. He never washed anything other than his fingers, okay? I believe. I wasn't there, witnesses. But second thing is he wrote avidly against smoking. He didn't like smoking, so he was ahead of his time there. And thirdly, he could calculate how fast a witch could fly. Okay? So he's dealing with the whole business of what happens to Ireland and all of that. And in fact, I believe he was quite a humane man in ways. But there is one incident which is a stark reminder of how things can go wrong, perhaps. Brian O'Rourke, a significant chieftain in the northern half of Ireland, was helping survivors of the Spanish Armada. And he went to Glasgow to recruit some mercenaries. Glasgow in Scotland, was picked up there by King James and sent down to Queen Elizabeth, who put him in the Tower. And because he wouldn't submit to her supremacy over him, he was executed. He was hanged, drawn, and quartered. Now, if you think about it, you want to go to the Tower if you're Irish? So during the 9 Years' War, no Irish man, no Irish leader went into the Tower of London, whether they were just very good at keeping out of the way or what it was. But for 9 years, none of them went in. After the 9 Years' War, very significant leaders of Ireland went into the Tower of London to be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure. You had to be a superior type of prisoner before you got into the Tower of London. And only people who could perhaps cause major disruption in the realm would be detained in there. And there would be reasons why they'd be detained, not executed. The English would recognize that at some future point their influence might be of use to them, so they would keep them rather than kill them, or they might kill them rather than keep them. In the case of Archbishop Cray, he went there 4 times and finally was poisoned there. So there's some. I did a master's degree in Trinity College, finished a year ago, and I did my dissertation on the Irish in the Tower of London at that time. And it really is, I can tell you something, I have no problem believing that somebody killed Princess Diana, having read how many kings, princes, and so on were killed in the Tower of London in suspicious circumstances, very suspicious circumstances, and the cover-ups involved in all that. So O'Neill is increasingly uncomfortable, feels he may be invited to the Tower, feels if they get him to the Tower, it'll be a one-way street for him, they'll kill him when they get him there, and he decides, and obviously he's making these plans behind the scenes, he's hired somebody to go and hire a ship. The ship's arrived at Dundalk, apparently. Somebody comes from Dundalk to Mellifont Abbey to tell him. He says goodbye to his great friend, the abbot there, and he walks 150 miles or so to Rathmullen, which is on the water just beside us. And the ship is waiting there. He's got 99 of his relatives and friends and soldiers and confessors and all those kinds of people with him. They get on board the ship, they gather firewood, whatever they need, and off they go to Spain. Okay, this is what's known as the flight of the Earls. They go to Spain, but they don't get to Spain, and that was their biggest problem. They got blown off course, and they ended up near Cherbourg in northern France. And the French were told by the English, you're not allowed to let these guys cross France into Spain. Okay? And the French were saying, well, the English can get lost, we'll be hospitable to whoever we like. The Irish said, well, the Spanish still have a great influence in Flanders. So they walked across northern France to Flanders. And they ended up in a place called Leuven or Louvain outside Brussels, where there was an Irish college. And on the way, they lost, the men folk got separated from women folk, and there was a period of great anxiety among the group and all of that. And why do we know this? One, O'Neill's secretary was on that ship. His name was Tag O'Keenan, and he wrote a diary of the flight, beginning at Mellifont Abbey and ending about 2 years later in Rome. And then it disappears, presumably because he dies, along with all the others who died about that time. But Tag O'Keenan is interesting for a number of reasons. His brother is hanged in Derry in 1615, and that family is still a Republican family in Derry, as far as I can see. Is still the name, still the presence of O'Keenans in the Republican movement in Derry. But Tag writes this narrative of the flight. It's not political. It's what happened every day. What kind of birds landed on the ship? How did we feed them? Who did we give them to when we got to France? What churches did we visit? What prayers did we say? Particularly religious. Okay. So he brings the story right over to Louvain, and in Louvain they leave the children and the women, and the menfolk, or perhaps the menfolk and the more able-bodied people without children, end up making their way to Rome. But they have to make their way to Rome via what is now Switzerland, because they're not allowed back into French territory and all of this. So that a really hazardous journey all the way from just north of Dublin to the northern coast of Ireland, down the west coast of Ireland in a storm, across northern France, down through Belgium, Switzerland, and eventually into Rome, where they are met. All along the way, they're met with great pomp and ceremony and hospitality by all the people that they meet. And I was thinking about this, hard to make these journeys, hard enough to make them now. Make them on foot then with pack horses. Pretty tough. And it must have been, these people must have been able to endure awful hardship to make their way on such a journey. And even the cramped conditions in these types of ships would have killed many people. But they end up in Rome. And in Rome, they're given wonderful hospitality. On that, I don't remember the name of the street, but on that, the main street up into the Vatican, that great big wide street up there, one of the houses in that street was given to them for them to live in. And they were given pensions by Spain, who at the same time said, stay in Rome, or don't come to us in Spain. And there's a wonderful book by Micheline Kearney Walsh called Destruction by Peace that includes facsimiles and translations of all of these letters that Hugh O'Neill wrote from Rome to Spain, asking for assistance to go back to Ireland. Now, then the tragedy starts. And this is what I wanted to get down to. I don't know where I am on time, by the way. How am I doing? 6 minutes. Really? No one tells me that, So, some of the people who were on the flight, we have Rossa O'Doherty. Rossa would probably, as a little girl, have played on the island that we live on. Rossa is a giant of Irish history in terms particularly of women folk, because it's very hard to find women folk or records of what women were doing in relation to history in Ireland. Men got educated, women didn't get educated, and all of that. This woman towers over this more than half a century with regards to the work she carried out. She was the sister of Cahir Rua O'Doherty, the last chieftain of the peninsula on which we live. And she travelled on the flight with her husband, who was Cahir O'Donnell, brother of the O'Donnell chieftain, and their son Hugh O'Donnell, who later, and I was going to mention these one by one, but it's almost impossible. Hugh is killed in a brawl in Brussels, street brawl in Brussels. Now, we're never going to find out how that brawl came about, but it strikes me that when O'Sullivan is killed in a street brawl in Madrid or Corunna in Spain, there may be some similarities, because certainly in the O'Sullivan case, there were English agents in attendance while this brawl was going on, or while this duel was provoked, or whatever exactly happened. So Rossa is married to Cahir. Cahir is the brother of Red Hugh, and for a short time Cahir is the chieftain, but Cahir dies in Rome, very young, and is buried in Rome. Now he dies sometime after a visit to Ostia, where there's supposed to have been a lot of malaria at the time. So these guys may have caught some disease. The Irish tend to believe these guys were systematically hunted down and poisoned by English agents. Certainly the English would have hunted them down and poisoned them if they got them first. So I have no difficulty, there's no difficulty at all in finding paperwork that proves that the English sent agents to the continent to poison the people who left on the flight. So Rossa then marries Owen Roe O'Neill, nephew of Hugh O'Neill, the man who led the flight. And when she marries Owen Roe, she spends some 45 years as a fundraiser, messenger, all across Europe on his behalf for the wars of the 1640s. When Cromwell was involved in the wars in England, she was touring Europe on behalf of her husband and the Irish movement. And that Irish movement, and this is significant, the flight had happened. The flight today, historians believe, was a strategic retreat. This was what was supposed to happen, but it was happening 40 years after it should have. And who's there? The only survivor that I'm aware of the flight, Rossa O'Doherty, is there actually 54 years after the flight is over, still involved in the struggle for Irish freedom. What's very interesting about her is she's buried in Louvain, and her tombstone is marked. Her tombstone is there. So you can go and you can visit the tomb of an Irish chieftain woman, and it's the only one that I'm aware of in the world, anywhere. You can't see them in Ireland. It's the only one there is, and it's still there. Next person who's of interest in this is Con O'Neill. Con is, I think, 4 years old, and he doesn't make it to the flight. He's in the foster care of Nuala O'Donnell, his aunt, and he's somewhere with a herd. The way they would do this is to hide these important children from the English. They would follow the herds, and so their care would be wherever, slightly nomadic, moving around all the time. Hugh O'Neill held that boat as long as he could hold the boat for Con, because Con was supposed to be coming, but Con didn't make it. So Con was picked up by Sir Toby Caulfield and brought over to the now conquered Armagh, where Con was very soon considered to be a threat and was sent to Dublin Castle. And then shortly after that he was sent to Eton College in England, where he was to be educated as an English gentleman. Sometime around 1618, they again decided that Con was a threat, and Con was delivered to the Tower of London, and Con was never heard of again. By that time, what was he? He was getting up to 18 years of age or something around that age. The bills for his education, his shoe shining, his bed making, are still available in Eton College to see today, which is kind of another little reminder. Rory O'Donnell, who took over the chieftainship from Red Hugh when Red Hugh died in Spain, he dies very soon after they arrive in Rome, and he too is buried in Rome. Cahir O'Donnell, his brother, husband of Rossa, he dies, and he's buried in the same grave in Rome. Hugh Maguire and Hugh McMahon decide to make their way from Rome to Spain by land. So they walk up the coast of Italy, and they get as far as Genoa, and they die within 6 hours of each other. I call that suspicious. Same meal. That's how they did it those days, you know. Bernard O'Neill, the teenage son of Hugh, I think he's 13 or 14 at the time, he's found hanged in his cell, in his room in Louvain. And the first report said, well, he hanged himself. But the two people who found him found that his hands were tied behind his back. So he would have had difficulty hanging himself. Hugh O'Donnell, son of Rossa, killed in the brawl in Brussels. Hugh O'Donnell, Rory's son, was killed at the head of his army fighting for Spain against France in 1640. Cormac O'Neill, Hugh O'Neill's brother, left at home at the flight. He ends up in the Tower of London, where he spends 19 years before he dies. O'Sullivan Bear, the chieftain of the O'Sullivans, who marched his clan 300 miles after the Battle of Kinsale from the extreme south of Ireland right up into Leitrim and then on to Dungannon to join with O'Neill. He ends up dying in a brawl and his brother wrote the Catholic History of Ireland, which is one of the key sources of key Irish sources of information for this time. Neil Garve O'Donnell, who was a traitor and betrayed Red Hugh O'Donnell, he ends up dying in the Tower of London with his son. He's considered to be possibly useful to the English, so they don't kill him, they don't kill his son, they put them in the Tower, and they live there as guests of the Queen. Hugh, Baron of Dungannon, the eldest son of Hugh O'Neill, he dies in Rome after that visit to Ostia also, and he's buried there too. John O'Neill, his brother, who Velázquez, can I say that right? The famous painter, has in one of his paintings of the Spanish court, he dies at the head of his army fighting for Spain against France. Brian O'Rourke, son of Brian, who was beheaded after being handed over to Elizabeth by James I, he dies in the Tower of London. Tag O'Keenan disappears from history. Father Lochry, O'Neill's confessor, who leaves on the flight, he comes back and he's hanged, drawn and quartered outside Dublin. O'Cahan, who was O'Neill's ally in the north, he ends up dying in the Tower of London. By the way, a funny reference I found in studying information in the Tower of London was that I think it was O'Rourke, but I don't want to insult the man. So whichever one of them it was, he was let out for 3 days and 3 nights to visit a brothel. And a history professor in TCD told me, you know what, he said, I think I have information. I haven't conclusively proved this yet. They guard their information carefully, do historians. Do you know that? He said there was a room at the back of that brothel where an Irishman could buy a ticket to the continent for £5. So the Irish would escape from the Tower of London, not back to Ireland, but from the Thames to France. So maybe he wasn't in the brothel. But I looked at 200 pages of, I don't know, 10, maybe 5, 6, 7,000 prisoners, and he's the only one who was let out to a brothel. So O'Kane dies in the Tower. And the interesting story about O'Kane is his wife visits him in the Tower. They conceive a son there. That son later joins Owen O'Neill's army in Spain and is considered a threat by the English, and finally is killed in County Derry in 1643. So he comes back to Ireland. McCarthy ends up in the Tower from down in County Cork. So all these individuals who went on the flight is just a long list of tragedy. And tragedy becomes very real and poignant when you pick up the letters written by the wives of the men in the Tower, where they're pleading for some kind of assistance to look after the children of these men as they wander landless to and fro throughout Ireland. And these letters are pathetic. They really are pathetic. They're included in C.P. Meehan's book, The Fate and Fortunes of the Earls of Tyrone and Tyrconnell. They really are pathetic to read because these people are completely destitute, and they become the wandering Irish on the Irish roads, I would say, traceable maybe forward to some of today's itinerants, as we particularly from a few years before that. So just to race down through some of the references that you might be interested in following up. C.P. Meehan, a priest in the mid-1800s, wrote this wonderful book, The Fate and Fortunes of the Earls of Tyrone and Tyrconnell. He also wrote several histories of the Franciscans in Ireland, who were very involved in all that went on in terms of Irish politics and so on at the time. Micheline Kearney Walsh, a librarian from UCD, wrote this book, which is similar but has more detail, and it's called Destruction by Peace, and it's about Hugh O'Neill after Kinsale and after the flight. The State Papers of Ireland, the English State Papers of Ireland, they're called the Calendar of State Papers Ireland, CSPI, give you the English detail, their recorded messages back and forward, and their orders in relation to Ireland. Peccata Hibernia, written by an English soldier in the southern half of Ireland, gives you that side of the story, the English side in the southern half of Ireland for that time. O'Sullivan's book, The History of Catholic Ireland, a very detailed book on the Catholic side, on the Catholic Irish side, about what happened in the deep south of Ireland at that time. Father Murphy wrote a book called Red Hugh O'Donnell in 1894, and that book is quite easily available from the Irish Text Society and gives you wonderful detail on the Irish side in the north, as does the Annals of the Kingdom of Ireland, which were written in the early 1600s in Donegal and in Belgium. And after that, there's a lot of modern stuff written by modern historians. All very good stuff, but all, well, take a spoon of something when you read it, you know, because some of it is obviously there are new interpretations and there's a certain amount of revisionism going on. Now, that's the story of 9 Years' War. It's a little bit about the flight. It's an immense subject. But what is really important about it is not the lead up to it, not the event, but the aftermath. And the aftermath of the flight of the Earls, Ireland is leaderless. It's leaderless. There is no political, military structure whatsoever left to the native Irish. Their lands are taken from them wholesale in the northern. It already happened in the south of Ireland from 50 to 100 years before that. Their land is stripped from them in the northern half of Ireland. It's planted with people from lowland Scotland, including not the Johnstons. In our particular family, we came in as soldiers. Soldiers, mind you, are paid for their duties in the army by being given large tracts of Irish land. And this new community emerges, which sees itself as having a divine right to the land of the destitute Irish. Of course, the Irish who stayed weren't terribly happy about that. Of course, the Irish in the Tower would agitate if they could, and of course the Irish on the continent were agitating all the time. And this went on. 1615, there was rumours of a rebellion. Hugh O'Neill did his level best to get back to Ireland and was ordered to stay. He's now 66 years old, I think. He's ordered to stay in Rome, or he'll lose his pensions and the pensions for his wives and children and all that kind of thing. So he doesn't come back, and that rebellion doesn't happen. 1641, a rebellion does happen. It's quite a successful rebellion at times. There's a confederation, the Pope gets involved and all that kind of stuff, and then Cromwell finally comes to Ireland. The rebellion somewhat falls apart, and that rebellion of 1641 to 1652 is where, if you like, issues relating to the flight of the Earls kind of finish. That's sort of the end of it, 45, 50 years later. There are no more people left after Rosso O'Doherty, who dies in 1660. There's no one left after that who was involved in the flight. No descendant of any significant person who was involved in the flight was left at that point. Now, again, to go back to the significance of it. So we've got this Protestant planted people from Scotland now in the northern half of Ireland. We've got this disenfranchised, marginalised Catholic group, Irish group in the north of Ireland, living on the hillsides, needed by these new Protestants to, you know, take down the trees and help them establish industry and all that. And there's kind of a difficult relationship existing there where the Protestants have walled towns to run into when they get uncertain about events, and the Catholics are uncertain about events all of the time. That's the origins of the troubles in Northern Ireland today. So the aftermath, the plantation of Ulster, that's, if you want to find the origins of what's going on in Northern Ireland, that's where they are, rooted firmly in the 9 Years' War, the flight of the Earls, and the plantation of Ulster that comes after it. Okay, thank you very much. If I've said enough, I'll take questions if I'm able.
Very good. Thank you. Well, Tony certainly would entertain any questions that you have, either regarding the lead up to the flight, the 9 Years' War, or even some of the Reformation stuff, or the stuff after, all the way down to Princess Di, by the sound of it. So.
She was Irish, by the way.
Right.
It's the reason why they killed her. Wasn't her mother Irish?
Yeah, she was Spencer.
Spencer, Anglo-Irish. Anglo-Irish Muslim on the throne, you know.
Reason enough.
The inquiry into her death is going on right now, and it's going to be interesting.
Was there a specific reason why the Spanish were so hesitant to aid O'Neill in the turn in 1615?
Well, peace had broken out between Spain and England, and no one wanted to tinker with that. I think, to some extent, both countries were bankrupt, and both countries were having great difficulty coming out of a period when both had been ruled by very solid, enduring monarchs. And so all of that seemed to be gone. There were, it's a I don't know, and I'm not going to pretend I know lots and lots about this, but I know that there was huge Spanish influence in the English court in the 1580s, or 1570s perhaps, when Bloody Mary was on the throne. And Bloody Mary, of course, killed many Protestants, so Protestants in England became very suspicious of the Spanish. So there was a lot of stuff going on in the background on a lower level that fomented and kept this war between Spain and England going. And, of course, Drake was attacking, well, on the one hand, Drake and the other guy, what do you call him, the mathematician, Walter Raleigh, they were stealing Irish children from Irish shores and selling them into slavery. They were also burning gold ships and stealing the gold of English ships coming back from the New World. So they were pirates as well. So all of that wasn't making England very happy with Spain. And then there was the whole business of the religious thing and Rome and all of that going on. And it goes back, I say I don't know enough about it, but we have Henry VIII discarding his Spanish wife, his only wife, his first wife, if you like. So that kind of been in there somewhere too, you know.
I think part of it too is the fact that the Spanish America was beginning to have problems with the gold, and as a result, Spain defaulted on her payments 3 times between 1550 and 1600. She would do it 3 more times between 1600 and 1650. After the Armada, the center of gravity shifted from fighting Protestants in the north to the Mediterranean in the south, and her major enemy became the Turks. And so, after having kind of gotten chewed up a little bit in the north, she wanted to try to retain some type of semblance of balance with the New World, but also began to look more and more towards kind of the east. And she won a major battle at Lepanto Bay in the 16th century, and she hoped to do more of that in the 17th. And after Philip II had died, Philip III came in. He did not have the same animosity towards Elizabeth. See, Philip II, who died in 1598, had been married to Mary Tudor. He had proposed to Elizabeth, had proposed to Mary, Queen of Scots, because he felt he needed the English against France. France was in the midst of their own civil war, the War of the Three Henrys. And so he no longer saw that as a problem. He no longer felt that England was that much. He wanted to keep Flanders, but it was the Turks and it was the New World that I think became more of the focus of Spain.
Am I right that James VI of Scotland was the son of Mary Queen of Scots?
Yes.
And Mary Queen of Scots was put to death by Elizabeth.
And it was interesting.
So Elizabeth is waiting for the son of the person she put to death.
Well, it's interesting in that Philip had proposed to her after she'd been run out of Scotland, and she was executed. He proposed to Elizabeth. His first wife Mary died. He proposed to Elizabeth, strikes out there. He proposed to Mary, Queen of Scots. That was shot down. She was executed in 1687. I'm sorry, 1587.
Yeah.
The very next year, 1588, is the Armada. And most historians say there's a direct link between those two events, that he's tried 3 ways to marry England, and then he said, to hell with it, he just tried to invade it. And when that didn't pan out, he said, to hell with it entirely. And the handwriting was on the wall, because he was going to use the Irish as a surrogate to just kind of keep them busy. And when that kind of fell through, he just washed his hands of it, looked to the Americas and the Turks as being the major concern.
The Irish leaders actually offered the realm of Ireland to England, to Spain at that time, which was another interesting, dominion, if you like, for the Spain.
The backdrop too is that at the end of that Sunday, there's several major events which take place, and so we're commemorating the flight of the Earls. This is also interesting that England felt relieved at this point, because we are also commemorating the 400th anniversary of Jamestown. they finally felt we don't have that much to worry about. We can begin to plant plantations here. They practiced in Ireland. They know how to do it. Kill off as many of the guys as you can. Marry the women off into slavery and put the rest of them on reservations. It was called Connaught. And if that sounds a little like English policy towards Indians, as Tony alluded to earlier, there's no mistake about it. That was just exactly how they approached it.
Yes.
Yes, the people who left in the flight of the Earls, it was mainly the leadership. There wasn't that many ordinary people. It was mainly the chieftains and...
No, you're right, but a lot of soldiers as well, who would have been ordinary people, if you like. Mercenary soldiers left by tens of thousands. Indeed, the English forced them to leave, or in some cases gave them the option to leave. Throughout the 1600s, army after army after army, right up to 40,000 men leaving at the Siege of Limerick. They became known as the Wild Geese. Now,
the actual flight of the Earls, you said, was 99 people?
99 people, yeah.
99.
Yeah.
And they spoke Irish and English both, or mainly Irish?
Oh, well, certainly Irish, certainly Latin, probably English, and in many cases other languages from continental Europe, because the sons of Irish chieftains they'd been sending their sons to continental Europe for years, to Irish colleges, and that picked up pace in 1600. I read one time in a book, it's called Irish Chieftains and Leaders, I think, that most of the officers who came back to Ireland in 1641 with Owen Roe O'Neill, nephew of Hugh O'Neill, could speak up to 7 languages, and had to be able to speak up to 7 languages to be commanders in the armies of Flanders. And you can imagine a lot of languages were spoken around Flanders at the time.
Speaking of language, as a student of Irish immigration history in the U.S., I've read that the Irish immigrant, the average Irish immigrant, by the time of the American Civil War, could not speak English. Apparently, some students have reported that a majority of those who arrived from Ireland were non-English speakers. Would you agree with that from the research?
I would say that. I would say that's correct. But well, in 1690 we had this battle in Ireland between 2 English kings. Okay, King William and King James, and the Irish armies left, and all of that after that. We then had the 1700s, during which it's difficult to find out much history of Ireland. Okay, but certainly the English were not out there teaching the Irish English. I don't believe. They banished them to west of the Shannon, and largely they were left to their own devices. They suffered several famines, and then they got Catholic emancipation in 1829, and then they had the famine, the major famine in 1847. And at that point, there was mass emigration of very poor people, and those would have been the Irish-speaking people of Ireland, and they would have come to the Americas with no English or very little English.
Would you believe then it would be safe to assume that it was mostly then the Ulster Irish that arrived in America that could speak English?
The Ulster Irish came before that, I think, and they were the people from whom your 15 Irish non-Catholic presidents were descended, if you like. The Presbyterians came. Yeah.
Their legacy of immigration
Yeah.
persisted throughout the 19th century.
Yeah, yeah. They would have been English-speaking, possibly Scots Gaelic speaking, but now speaking this strange new language we have called Scots. What do they call Ulster Scots? It's a kind of somebody said it's English for learners. So it's got some Lowland Scots words in it that, in fact, I would have been familiar with as a child, but it's not a distinct language.
And as a follow-up to that, would you care to comment on any ways or the ways in which the English in the 18th and 19th century attempted to perhaps forcibly acculturate the Irish?
I'm not sure that they did. I think ostracize the Irish, and if you're speaking about in Ireland.
I'm speaking about in Ireland. I'm thinking about in terms of essentially attempting to erase their history.
Oh yeah, I mean, we had a very funny incident. We were asked to write a local history for a local community in County Derry inside occupied territories in Ireland recently, and we wrote it because there's a 6th century church there, and the Protestant community look after this church. Okay? So we wrote this history, and they came back and said, we're not going to pay you if you put anything into this history before the plantation of Ulster. So they thought that the ground on which they lived had been created on 1612 or something. And it became a major issue with an elected city council before they finally agreed that we could be paid for doing what they had asked us to do in the first place and write a history. They did not want to know of any education or anything else. And I point out something to you about that. All these little churches all across Ireland, of which there are thousands, and abbeys, once upon a time were full of artefacts. They were roofed. They were pleasant places to be. And if you went to France today, you'd be in these places looking at the artefacts they have. Ours are all gone. So a big chunk of our heritage went with the Reformation and with Viking activity as well and so on. But a big, big chunk of it left. And it's interesting, we still turn up bits of it now and again in boglands and so on.
But the oral tradition has continued to carry on much of that history.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, at times, it is not considered to be credible because it is not written.
That's right. That's true. But the annals of the Kingdom of Ireland, the annals of the Four Masters, essentially is an oral history written down. And it begins in the Garden of Eden. It does, actually.
During the famine, I have a brother-in-law whose name is Daly, and they're Presbyterian, but they were Catholic 150 years ago, and they were called supers. And in order to qualify during the famine, to get soup. And the only people that were pretty straight-laced, quite frankly, were Quakers. But quite often the established church of Ireland, which is the Anglican church, they'd give soup if you stopped going to the Catholic church. And hence they were called supers. Secondly, the Irish language died. They say that the death of the Irish, the greatest victim of the famine was the Irish language. Because from that point on, English was stressed. Because quite often, those that could got out, the famine ships, and the majority of the population were in fact English-speaking then after that point. And so I think that the kind of merger of the language, because it was oral, it took with it a lot of the stories, a lot of the heritage, and it's questioned now by the professional historians as to whether it's authentic, whether it's accurate, and that type of stuff. And so it passes off as legend and what have you. There was a fellow by the name of Delaney that wrote an interesting book, maybe somebody's familiar with it. It's just called Ireland. And it's about a storyteller in the 50s and the 60s. And that was one of the great sources of Irish history, was in fact the storytellers that come about. And television has destroyed it. And, and that is another casualty, I think, as part of the rich heritage of, there are storytellers.
Oh, yeah.
Go into places in Ireland, rural Ireland, and the guy comes in and starts telling you the story. Where do you get this stuff? It's just passed on. And it's a very noble. It's the old tradition of the bard. And we as Americans, we're too damn electronic.
Yeah. But the interesting thing too about
we question.
Yeah. But he's one of the best storytellers in Ireland when he's there, by the way. One of the interesting questions to pose about, and just going back to this, probably 1 million Irish-speaking people died in the famine, and probably 1 million Irish-speaking people left as a result of the famine. And that was a quarter of the population. Now that's in the immediate years. What happened after that, of course, is, Uncle Dan is in Chicago. Well, send over my nephew, please. So it kept going, and it kept going right up till only a few years ago. But one of the questions about things like the flight of the Earls is, what if it hadn't happened? What if they had stayed? Some people in Ireland criticize them for leaving Ireland leaderless. And other people say, well, they had no option. They were individuals who were about to be killed if they stayed. And proof of that, I think, is that those who did stay were arrested, put in the Tower, executed, or whatever. So what did they leave us with? And sometimes I think it's a little bit like 1916. They left us with a problem. you know, that you can go back to and say, well, here's something you can hang your Irish nationalist hat on. This, in fact, there are many signs in the 9 Years' War and in the flight of the Earls of the birth of the Irish nation. This is where they begin to fight for religion, for land. They begin to have alliances among themselves, and they begin to be regarded by other nations as a nation in some small ways. So from that point of view, it's fairly important. One other thing I would like to say is go to Rome. And I think you should come to Ireland, of course. But if you're going to go to Ireland and follow up on Flight of the Earls type things, go to Rome. Go into San Pietro de Montorio on Janiculum Hill. And peel back the blue carpet up there and look at the magnificent graves of the Irish nobility that lie in that church. There's the use of white marble, as you know, in Rome and all of that. Outside that church, you get one of the best views of Rome that you can get. And inside that church is so peaceful. And here we have the only signs left of the flight of the Earls, with the exception of Ross's tomb over in Louvain. And they are, to me, just such beautiful things. And can I tell this story without, I'm lecturing to you. Christine went there with her sister, and, she said she got into the church, or maybe it was the second time that I went with you, and you said, yeah, these men are here. There's a feeling in that church for anyone who has a feel for Irish history that there is something in that church. So we went to Louvain, and we had Owen with us. And what was he, 6 years old? Something like that. And I decided to do a grave rubbing. I have these grave rubbings all framed now, by the way, because I brought them to the exhibition for the Flight of the Earls. And I got down on the floor with a big piece of paper, and I wanted to start doing my graphite tracing of this gravestone so I could bring it home. And I'm working, and I thought, I said, Owen, would you go around, this gravestone has been moved, I said. Would you go around the church and tell us if you can figure out where Rossa and her children are buried? And off Owen went around the church, and we didn't pay any attention. And he stopped dead just to the left of the high altar at the church, and he said, they're here. And the caretaker who moved the gravestone nearly fell down. He said, he's not just right, he's exactly right. That's where I took that gravestone from. So there may well be something in the psyche that comes down to us over the years, you know. But if you go up to Janiculum Hill, you'll also find it's the most popular church, or one of the most popular churches in the world for weddings. So the gravestones are usually covered. That's very good because it's kept them from getting worn out. And the place has usually got the best lilies in the world up and down both sides of the aisle. Any other questions?
Yeah, the Scots that came to Northern Ireland, there was an affinity between the Irish and the Scots, was there not? Is there some language similarities or?
This is the yeah.
Their common animosity towards the English, I'm surprised, was somehow trumped by religious differences.
Well, I don't know that I understand this well enough, but we had Highland Scots and we had Lowland Scots. Okay? Mostly Ireland was planted with Lowland Scots, who would have been the Scots that occupied that border territory between England and Scotland, and might well have had been involved in English administration and administration of the Crown of Scotland for many, many years. And I've looked at this and I've thought, maybe this was because King James had two courts. He had a court in Scotland and he had a court in England. When he came down to England, he didn't need his Scottish court anymore. And he also was asking the questions, how are we going to pay those soldiers who won that war in Ireland? So he ended up with a problem that he solved by giving Irish land away. But it wasn't Highland Scots people who were planted in Ireland. They were cleared out of the Highlands some 100 years later, 150 years later. It was Lowland Scot people. Now, the affinity between the north coast of Ireland and Scotland would have been more with the Western Isles. So, Reg O'Donnell's mother was Eneen Dove, daughter of MacDonald, Lord of the Isles. And there would have been mercenary soldiers moving in either direction, depending on what might be going on. But I don't fully understand it, but what I do know is it's not as simple as Braveheart. Not quite, you know. But I do think that if you brought us all together in a room, we might end up with the Scots and the Irish and the Welsh joining up against the English even now. And it was interesting to hear Roger say, when you do this experiment with the Unionists, the Nationalists, literature, everybody ends up hating the English for some reason, you know. But that affinity, I mean, you know, for example, do you know something about Glasgow? Do you know anything about Glasgow? Celtic Football Club, okay, is followed by Irish Catholics, and Rangers by Irish Unionists, if you like, as well as others. And the Scottish people follow them as well, of course, but you will never get a Celtic supporter who will become a Rangers supporter. You will never get a Rangers supporter who will become a Celtic supporter. And very short time ago, only like 7 or 8 years ago, a Protestant player from Glasgow Rangers transferred to Glasgow Celtic, right? And they said, well, we always knew he was a bastard anyway. I mean, really only so few years ago, and they're working hard in the football circles to get rid of that problem. But again, it shows you that there is a division in Scotland, if you like, similar to this division in Ireland. Then the other ties that would have, like, when I was a child, and I don't know if it still happens, but it certainly happened up until quite recently, you would have busloads and boatloads of Irish going over to Scotland to pick potatoes, as we call it, to gather the potato crop in September and spending 2 or 3 months there, and then coming back to Ireland. You'd have had all that going on. But again, it was more Highland than Lowland. So I'm not pretending I understand exactly what went on, but we did not end up with Highland Scots people planted in Northern Ireland, not so much as Lowland. Johnston, for example, is a Lowland Scot name. John Hume, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, his name is Lowland Scot. Gerry Adams' name is Lowland Scot. You know, so it's people who were probably loyal to the establishment rather than disloyal to the establishment. So the loyal Scots that were loyal to the Crown of England are the people who got paid in Irish lands, not the disloyal Scots who would have been perhaps more friendly with the Irish. But it's not that easy.